Happy International Workers' Day, everybody. Greetings from my back room in Leeds. I hope people have enjoyed the other sessions today. And I'm delighted to be introducing a fantastic panel for a discussion on the challenges facing us all economically. We've got a fantastic list of speakers today. We've got Anne Pettifor from Positive Money. We've got Michael Jacobs from the Sheffield Policy Research Institute. We've got Andrew Fisher, former Labour Chief Policy Advisor. We've got Prem Sikka, Professor of Accountancy and Corporate Reform Expert. We've got John Hillary, who is the former Director of War on Want and Labour's International Trade Advisor. We've got Rory McQueen, former Chief Economic Advisor to the Shadow Chancellor. And we've got one of our fantastic members of Parliament, Apsana Begum. I think many people are still joining us online, so I might slow down slightly. But it gives me great pleasure today to introduce a politician who helped to make Labour an anti-austerity party, because we haven't always been an anti-austerity party. For many, many years, he was producing alternative budgets each and every time, and he became our fantastic Shadow Chancellor between 2015 and just a few weeks ago. One of the greatest figures, past and present and future, from the Labour left. I'm delighted to hand over to John McDonnell MP.
Thanks, Richard. I'm not sure about all those superlatives. One of the best jokes that Gordon Brown did, as I was on a platform with him and I was introduced as the Shadow Chancellor, and Gordon Brown said he was always the Shadow Chancellor, even when he was the Chancellor. I thought it was quite right, actually. And look, I won't. The reason for this session, and a happy May Day, solidarity to everyone. Look, the reason for this session is I brought together a group of people who've been basically I've admired over the years, I've been working with over the years as well, and listening to their advice and reading their materials on the development of our economy, both domestically but also globally. And the intention of this discussion is to just listen to their views about the sort of society and economy that we need to create post the pandemic. And a lot of the discussions that have been taking place in the recent weeks are about how we confront the coronavirus pandemic. Of course they are. It's about how we save lives, but it is also about learning lessons about the economic policy of recent years in particular, but also the sort of values that we want to underpin our society in the future, and the sort of society and economy that we need to construct as a result of learning some of those lessons. So I thought, what better than to bring together half a dozen or so of the people who have been, well, over recent years in particular, at the leading edge of some of the debates about the sort of economy that we need. And it is coming from a socialist perspective, of course it is. And that is, therefore, based upon the values of solidarity. And that's exactly what May Day is all about. And during the 80s, Neil Kinnock sent Bernard Crick, Professor Bernard Crick, to do a booklet on what is socialism. And Bernard Crick came back and said, look, you can define it very quickly. It's about the achievement of equality through democracy. And I think, if anything, this crisis has taught people is about the grotesque levels of inequality. That's the first thing, but also how, to a certain extent, our democracy has failed us in achieving the investment, particularly in our public services, that we need to prepare us for crises like these, but also in the distribution of the rewards within our society, where actually I think it has made us challenge the values that some people hold. So how much we value, for example, the cleaners, the street cleaners, the people who clean our hospitals, the nurses and the carers and the doctors and others, so much more now, I think, than many people did before this crisis. So the idea of this discussion is to, what are the lessons we're learning at the moment, but what is the society and the economy that we need to create now post the pandemic itself? That's it. The range of expertise we've brought together, I think, is superb. They're all people who've worked very hard in their own fields at the radical edge of development of policy, Yes, and those ideas did feed into the last two Labour Party manifestos, but actually the most important thing now is developing the programme that we need in the coming years. So yes, the last two manifestos were excellent, but I think we need to go further now, most probably in a much more radical direction, recognising the challenges that we now face. And the twin challenges, obviously, are the pandemic and the outcome of the pandemic in terms of the economic recession that we face, but also that overhanging threat, existential threat of climate change. So those two crises that we need to tackle, I think, are going to become part of the central themes of the discussion that we'll have. So Richard, over to you. Let's have our first contributor.
Thanks very much, John, and I'm delighted to introduce our first expert, who is Michael Jacobs, a professor of political economy at the University of Sheffield. It gives me great pleasure to ask him to fill us all in.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you, John, for that introduction. Hello, everybody. I hope you're safe, and good May Day to you. I wanted just to talk a little bit about the other crisis. We're living through an extraordinary crisis now, but the crisis of climate change and of wider environmental breakdown, of biodiversity loss and so on has not gone away. And there are already people who are saying we can only deal with one crisis at a time. We need to get rid of our environmental and climate protections as we build our way out of this crisis. That is wrong. And it's wrong because the crisis of climate and environment is one that is going to hit us increasingly. Many people around the world already suffering from it. And it's also wrong because we can use the recovery process from the present coronavirus crisis to help build a lower carbon and greener economy. We're going to need a new round of stimulus measures as the economy comes out of lockdown. We're going to have very large numbers of people unemployed. Large numbers of businesses have gone bankrupt and will do so. And even though the government has already spent lots of money and to workers, we're going to need more because the economy is going to be in what member of the Bank of England monetary policy deepest recession probably. To the environmental good economy, health.
There seems to be problems with the signal for Michael there.
Is it? Yeah, I'm really sorry about this.
Don't worry.
Having internet problems. Is it impossible to hear me?
It seems to have recovered now.
Okay, let me try again. So there are lots of measures that we can take in stimulating the economy to create jobs for the people who unfortunately will have been made unemployed in this crisis. For example, in building energy efficient homes, in retrofitting homes and buildings with energy efficiency, in building electric vehicle charging networks in cities, in cycle ways and pedestrianisation schemes, in green public transport, in nature conservation and land management and so on. And that's where we should be thinking of directing the recovery measures that we will need. And then beyond that, we need to build a zero carbon economy. The government has now put into law the net zero target for emissions by 2050. That needs to be brought forward. But most of all, we need a plan for the next 10 years because that's when the work has to be done. And that's building an industrial strategy, as we set out in the Labour manifesto, that create jobs in the new green industries of the future. We will need a national investment bank to do it because the private sector just doesn't do that. In the research and innovation that will build the economy of the future. We need to build not just climate targets, but wider environmental targets. We recommended an Environment Act that would constrain the economy to live within the global environmental limits that will sustain life, not just in this country, but across the world, and will create the space for developing countries to live within environmental limits and to grow and provide incomes too. So that's a global justice framework for establishing the kind of economy that will sustain us all. But, and there is a big but, and this is the big challenge for us, this is not simply a process of creating green jobs, because there are lots of industries which are not sustainable in their current form, but which lots of people work in and which often provide good jobs, the oil and gas sector being a good example. So we've got to find ways of transitioning our economy from one that is in part brown to one that is green. And that's a difficult process, and we have to manage that. The idea of a just transition, one in which that involves is that they can move and one is really to be an easy process. So while celebrating the green jobs that we can create, we also have to work very hard at creating a just transition that can enable.
There seems to be some interference again. If it continues, you might wish to turn off your camera and then we could just get the sound without interruption. That's one option.
Sorry about that, but I've concluded what I wanted to say.
Well, that was fantastic. That was really useful. But every time there's a small bit of interference, I'm reminded that that policy they all scoffed at, the free broadband for the whole country, is proving to be more and more relevant. But thank you so much, Michael, for that really useful and really thought-provoking contribution. We really appreciate it. The next contributor is one of our fantastic new MPs, first elected in December 2019 in the very historically relevant socialist movement's constituency of Poplar and Limehouse, where, of course, George Lansbury and others a long, long time ago resisted cuts to the local authorities. And the next speaker is a fantastically inspirational MP who in just a few months as a Member of Parliament has done so much good work for her constituents locally, but has also really contributed to the national debate. So welcome to Apsana Begum.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks for those kind words, and happy May Day, everyone, and to everyone watching as well. So I want to sort of begin by sort of talking a bit about poverty and the situation with poverty and coronavirus. So according to the Office of Budget Responsibility, health restrictions and social distancing will mean that lower incomes, less spending and weaker asset prices, all of which will reduce tax revenues, with job losses requiring more public spending. And we already know that those with underlying health conditions are most at risk, and those people in poorer areas are already more likely to die from avoidable causes, given the widely noted links between deprivation, health inequalities, and life expectancy. Now, there was some data released today from the Office of National Statistics, which confirmed that the coronavirus feeds on inequality, with people living in more deprived areas seeing more mortality rates, more than double essentially than those in less deprived areas. So whilst we know that the coronavirus can affect everyone, it doesn't affect everyone in the same way. So it does differ depending on class and status. And this is of course of particular relevance to my constituency, Poplar and Limehouse, which suffers from some of the highest rates of poverty in the entire country. And what you kind of alluded to earlier and what John has alluded to, it's really after a decade of austerity and too many people remaining in trapped in sort of low-paid insecure work, that have been consistently failed by the social security system, that has also led to them bearing brunt of this crisis and the coronavirus. The Institute of Fiscal Studies report today also added to the growing evidence of the fact that Black and ethnic minority communities are disproportionately affected by the coronavirus as well, for a variety of complex and intersecting reasons. And yesterday, UK hospitals as well warned that BAME staff may be at greater risk of coronavirus, and it's really clear, I guess, that there are systemic economic inequalities that mean that ethnic minority communities are really unfairly disadvantaged by such a huge health crisis. Again, this comes after years of austerity, which has had a devastating impact on ethnic minority communities. And we're also seeing on top of that how the hostile environment has resulted in many migrants being left destitute and at greater risk of infection. One thing I did also want to say was, I mean, this pandemic has also exposed how the Tories' economy for the few is absolutely not fit for purpose and is fundamentally unfair and unequal. For example, I mean, this week, Care England published a paper calling for greater financial support for the care sector. And yet, CareTech, who run a large number of established residential care homes in the UK, have seen their shares rise in the recent period, and they announced in their words stronger revenues and margins. And is it not absolutely sort of obscene that as the coronavirus outbreak sweeps across our care homes, with the death toll rising, profits are being pocketed just by a rich few? Earlier this week on Wednesday, I mean, I spoke on the fire safety bill in Parliament, and years have passed since the Grenfell catastrophe, and yet still no one's been called to account. And it does, I guess, make you wonder sort of when will we ever get answers, and when will victims ever get justice? And it is absolutely disgraceful that there are still tens of thousands of residents still living in blocks with Grenfell-style cladding. And the truth is that decisions of central government stretching back years have led to the gutting of the country's fire safety regime and the failure to regulate high-rise residential buildings properly for fire safety. But also the policies relating to housing, local government, the fire and rescue service, research and other have been driven by the agenda of cuts, deregulation and privatisation, and that's been fostered and propped up by the direct lobbying of private business interests as well. I just want to also contribute to those delivering public and essential services, especially to our NHS staff on the front line. But it is also clear from all of this that public services as a whole have been completely ill-prepared for dealing with this type of crisis. And that's because we've seen spending cuts on a scale not seen for generations, with service cuts to cut to the bone, and in some cases beyond. So I guess I also want to sort of say that it's vital that economic measures are introduced to protect everyone's livelihoods, to ensure that those with sort of the broadest shoulders pay their fair share, and to require that companies in receipt of state bailouts share in the collective effort as well. It would be wrong, for example, to bail out tax dodgers like Richard Branson, or for public money to go to companies that continue to pay millions to executives or shareholders. And emergency state support for big businesses shouldn't just be handed out to those that are registered in tax havens or continuing with excessive executive pay. We should really learn from the bailout of the banks and actually make sure that the taxpayer gets value for money and accountability. But now we're of course in a time of sort of crisis politically. We can't underestimate the scale of the task in front of us, locally or nationally. And we have powerful enemies in the media, the establishment, the far right, big business, and our doubters. And I guess it's still shocking and shameful how the government is dragging their heels every step of the way regarding the current crisis. What could be more important than saving lives and protecting people's dignity in their later years? And I did want to also say, there is no doubt that our socialist policies are popular, and the framework of the debate has radically shifted in a relatively short amount of time, from public ownership of rail and key utilities to a massive house building program, to workers' rights, to the National Education Service. This crisis is again exposing the weakness in our economy and society. But I mentioned that this idea today, it's also showing us just how dependent we are on each other. And I too have been inspired, like many of you have, about how people have been organising to protect their communities. And I really think it's in the spirit that we really must go forward together to ensure that a society defined by solidarity and compassion, rather than insecurity and fear and inequality. So I'm there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Apsana. That was a really useful contribution, and I suppose supporting the points Apsana was making. what the new statistics show, and I'm just looking here, that according to Office of National Statistics data, coronavirus death rates are twice as high in the UK's poorest areas compared to in the UK's richest areas. And that really brings home what Apsana was saying. We've all seen, of course, as she outlined, the disproportionate effect on BAME communities, whether that's in the workplace or in the community itself. So thank you very much, Apsana. The great news is that there's over 500 people in this meeting as I speak. So hello to all 500 of you. Hope you're well. Hope you're having a fantastic May Day and hope that you're enjoying this and the other sessions. So on that note, I now want to move on to our next contributor, who is Andrew Fisher. Now, I remember well before Jeremy became leader of the Labour Party, reading his fantastic book about the failed experiment, which I thought explained in a very accessible way the failure of the domination of neoliberal economics for 40 years. And then, of course, he became one of the key people in the leader of the opposition's office whilst Jeremy was leader, and indeed became the chief policy advisor and played such a crucial role in putting together those fantastic socialist manifestos in 2017 and 2019. So I'd like to now welcome Andrew Fisher to share his thoughts and analysis with us.
Cheers. Thanks, Richard. And it's a real pleasure to be part of this this call and meeting, I suppose. I want to really talk about insecurity. And one of the mottos of the Labour movement is an injury to one is an injury to all. Our collective strength matters, but this crisis, I think, has exposed just how insecure life is for so many people. If you cast your mind back just a few months when the government was discussing its immigration policy, it defined anyone earning under £30,000 as unskilled and therefore not eligible for easy entry into the UK. And actually the workers we rely on most at the moment in this crisis are nurses, care workers, cleaners, supermarket workers, delivery drivers, all of whom earn significantly less in most cases than £30,000 a year. Those workers are low paid because the industries they work in, by and large, are often ununionised. And because even when they are unionised, the restrictive union laws we have in this country have weakened all workers across the board. And of course, Tony Blair once boasted that Britain has the most restrictive union laws in Western Europe. And of course, since Tony Blair's time, that's only got worse with the 2016 Trade Union Act. And when migrant workers or agency workers have fewer rights than every other workers or different rights to work, that opens the door to their exploitation as well and weakens every worker. So we need strong trade unions, we need strong trade union rights, and we need equal rights at work for all workers from day one. And the workers who suffered most are likely to be women, younger workers and migrant workers. And that's why it's important that we see a unity across all workers. Now, according to the TUC today, they've put out some research. 3.7 million of the key workers we're relying on most at the moment earn less than £10 an hour. 2/3 of those are women. 7 in 10 care workers working in care homes or as domiciliary care workers earn less than £10 an hour. So we need a minimum wage of at least £10 an hour now, as you may have read in the last couple of Labour manifestos. Now, Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell had a phrase, austerity is a political choice, not an economic necessity, which is absolutely true. But it's also true that low pay is a choice, not an economic necessity. I'll just take one example. Southern Cross was a care provider that went bust, I think in 2012, about 8 years ago. And at the point it went bust, its chief executive was being paid £430,000 a year. And yet most of its workforce, the vast majority of whom were women, often migrant women, were being paid less than the living wage. So don't tell me the money isn't there. And the reason people like Richard Branson has got his begging bowl out in the last week, the reason Elon Musk in the US is behaving like a Trump supporter on Twitter at the moment, saying lift the lockdown, is because they recognise another truth that we all know as well, which is billionaires don't create the wealth. workers do, and that's why they want a bailout at the moment. And workers should share in that wealth. We need we need not just compliance with tax avoidance, with paying their taxes, but we also need pay ratios within companies and within corporations to be part of any bailout as well, because it is absolutely ridiculous that people like Richard Branson or football clubs, I talk about my own, which thankfully got reversed, Tottenham, pay some of their players wages of 100 or 150,000 pounds a week, yet don't actually pay their ground staff the living wage. Now that is again another example of the gross exploitation we see within our society. And it comes down to three things, I think, ultimately. It's about a secure job and secure pay, no more poverty pay. What we can't afford actually is more multimillionaires and more billionaires. So coming out of this, yes, we do need public works. We need a job guarantee for workers because unemployment is going to have shot up during this crisis. And we need a minimum income guarantee for those who can't work, because nobody can survive on the poverty rates of benefits in this country. Job seekers allowance is just £74 a week. I noticed earlier today when I was looking back on something, 7 years ago, it was £72 a week. It's barely gone up in the last 8 years, and it wasn't enough then either. We have some of the lowest benefit levels in the world, certainly in the Western world. I'll give you one example. Ireland, which is a similar country to ours, their unemployment benefit is around £183 a week. Ours is 74. So again, we need much higher levels of benefits. We also need secure rights as well. And that is things like trade union rights, absolutely, but also equal rights as citizens to all of us in this country. Full rights of citizenship, ending the hostile environment, as Apsana said just now, and equal and full rights at work from day one. And the other thing is secure housing. We all need a right to our home. Before this crisis even started, rough sleeping had gone up 140% in this country over the last 10 years. There are 80,000 families with 127,000 children living in temporary accommodation without a home to call their own. So we need to build more council housing, we need secure tenancies, and we need to make sure that there are no evictions coming out of this crisis. The basic necessities of people's lives should not be at the mercy of landlords or corporations or even the government, frankly. These should be things that belong to us as basic human rights. And that's true here and around the world, of course. But we achieve all of that by being united and arguing for those basic rights for all. United we stand, divided we fall, comrades. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Andrew, for that concise and thought-provoking analysis of the situation we now face economically and how we need to change it. Because I do think that people that think that austerity is a political concept, an idea, is dead, are sadly mistaken. And whatever words Boris Johnson attempts to use at the moment, I do think that the concept of austerity will be revisited vigorously when the public health crisis is over. The Chancellor of the Exchequer has already said that this bill will need to be accounted for once the public health crisis is over. And we've got to make sure when that happens that we have a people's bailout, because previously it wasn't the people who were bailed out, it was the banks that were bailed out. So we can't have an equivalent of that happening again. So thanks very much, Andrew. And so that brings me on to our next contributor, who is from the University of Essex, where he's a professor of accountancy and corporate reform. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Prem Sikka.
Hello, good afternoon, and thank you, Richard. And it's a pleasure to follow the previous speakers, because what I'm going to say connects with what they have said. We know now that inequalities kill, and we know that they leave people much worse off. Some politicians this week have been talking about possibly reenacting austerity, but we know 12.8 million people in this country have either no savings or savings of less than £1,500. Can you imagine how on earth those people are going to survive with another dose of austerity? That simply is not on. What we need to change are the work practices. Most of us spend about a third of our life at work. We live in the era of universal suffrage. Until you cross the factory gate or the office door, they are only people who have put money in the shares can vote. You can invest your life, blood, sweat, brains, brawn in a company, but you actually have absolutely no say whatsoever. This is kind of modern kind of slavery, and we need to end this. We need to ensure that workers actually have seats on company boards, because workers, as Andrew said, create wealth. And it is with their own blood and sweat which sort of creates wealth. So we need to put workers on board so that they can actually disrupt in some ways the kind of a groupthink which thinks it is okay to pay excessive dividends. For example, when we looked at Carillion when it collapsed, what did we find? Carillion been basically massaging his books. It didn't really have the profits to pay dividends, but it cooked them up. Then it borrowed money to pay dividends. Well, that is absolutely crazy. And we saw similar kind of practices in many other companies as well. But if workers were sitting on board, somebody may well have questioned and said to the other board members, why are you not really focused on the long-term welfare of the company? Why are you not really focused on the pension scheme? Why are you not concerned about the welfare of the supply chain? So we need to get workers on the company board. That is an essential requirement. We are some 50, 60 years behind the rest of Europe. Places like Germany have been having them for nearly half a century. We need to change directors' duties to make sure that the director's duty is to stakeholders, not to shareholders. Shareholders don't really have a long-term interest in a company. Shareholders who trade on the stock market basically hang on to shares for about 4 to 6 weeks, which means they are essentially acting as speculators and traders rather than really as long-term investors. So we really need to ensure that people who have a long-term stake in a business are actually sitting on the board, participating in the decisions. We need to make sure that nobody can vote at the company's AGM. No shareholder can vote unless they have held shares for at least 2 years. This means that you can't just have these hostile takeovers where people just take over a company, strip the assets, run away because they collected their millions. So we need to change that. We also need to change the practices on executive pay. We need to get the employees and consumers to vote on executive pay. Companies always tell us consumers are the best judge of what a company does. Well, okay, let them vote on executive pay. And if the boss wants more and the workers have a vote, well, boss will definitely have to think about how the workers and even the consumers might react. So that should exert pressure on companies to reform themselves. I don't think it is a good idea to pay a bonus to any executive unless it is for extraordinary performance. And I'm yet to come across an executive who has exerted extraordinary effort to earn that particular bonus. So for a long time, CBI and others told us that nobody should really be able to make any decisions at any trade union meeting unless there is a 50% turnout. Well, let's apply that to vote on executive pay as well and say you can't have your pay unless there is a 50% turnout. And they said out of those who vote at the trade union meeting, you can't have any industrial action because that is extraordinary, they say, unless there is a 90% support. Well, let's apply that to the payment of bonuses as well and say, okay, you can't have your bonus unless the 90% of those who vote approve it. And so we need to apply that. We need to have a rule which says that if 20% of those people who vote on executive pay say no, companies should get a yellow card. And if the next year the same happens again, there's a red card, which means that the entire board, minus the managing director, has to offer themselves for re-election. We need to have some teeth to ensure that there is equitable distribution of income and there is pay. I would also like to recommend an inequality tax. We have accepted the principle that anyone who causes pollution must pay. Inequality is a form of social pollution. And it is increased because executives are collecting millions. People at the other end are barely able to make their ends meet. So we need to have an inequality tax, which might say something like, okay, you can pay as much as you like, but when it comes to tax purposes, we will only allow you a deduction of, say, 500,000 maximum per executive. Anything more than that is not a tax deductible expense, and therefore you will need to actually pay higher tax. In other words, companies will be penalized because they are creating this form of social pollution. And that would make them really think about many of the issues which we have been talking about. And that will also broaden the country's tax base. We also need to broaden the tax base, for example, by levying financial transaction tax, which a modest form of that was proposed in the last Labour manifesto. So what do we find at the moment? Hedge funds are making millions, shorting company shares, betting on corporate collapses. Many of them are also hiding in offshore tax havens. So we need to levy financial transaction tax. We need to ensure that offshore excursions are totally stopped. I won't have enough time to explain here how we're going to do that, but if anyone wants to write to me, I'll be happy to address that. We are failing to collect between 34 and 35 billion pound a year in taxes. That is the official number per the HMRC. Unofficially, it could be 100 billion. That means for the last decade, anything from 350 billion to £1 trillion of taxes have not been collected. What was the last time HMRC really challenged a big corporation or brought a case against them? We need to invest in HMRC to address these issues. We need to ensure that the tax returns of all large companies and wealthy individuals are publicly available, so that all of us as citizens can become auditors and alert HMRC, and if necessary, even take action ourselves. How am I doing time-wise, Richard?
No, that's fine. A couple more minutes is great.
Oh, okay, fine. We're also running in this country for a long time what I call a very large corporate welfare program. And the official name for this is tax reliefs. Numerous tax reliefs are given to corporations for which HMRC keeps virtually no record. There is no analysis, no evaluation. We don't even know if these tax reliefs, and there are 1,190 of them, whether they are delivering any of the economic benefits. Most recently, the National Audit Office looked at 362 of them, only found information about a small number of them, which added up to 155 billion. And it said HMRC still does not provide enough information. So a reason I mention these things is that there are some people going around, oh my God, we will all have to pay extra taxes to rebuild the economy. No, people at the bottom are already taxed enough. We don't have to pay extra taxes. We simply have to collect what is already due, whether it is through these tax reliefs or collecting the taxes which HMRC is not collecting, or ensuring that the companies can't run away to offshore tax havens to dodge taxes. So what I'm actually talking about is forging a new social contract between people and the government. And that contract is necessary, not just because we have a crisis at the moment. That contract is necessary because it is long overdue. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prem. That's fantastic. And I like the concept of inequality being a form of social pollution. I think that's a case that we need to make very clear. Now, it gives me a great pleasure to introduce our next contributor. And I have fond memories when I was younger of seeing our next contributor explain how the economy works in the Doncaster Trades Club, just by the train station there in Doncaster. And what Anne did at that time, and still does, is she explained in a really accessible way how the economy works and what needs to change, because there is this myth, which Anna's always successfully busted, that matters of the economy are only there for people who write for the Financial Times to analyse and discuss. And it became for too long the case that our political movement saw economics as something separate, something over there, something only the so-called experts are great and good could discuss. So I'm delighted to introduce from Prime Economics, Anne Pettifor.
Much, Richard. Thank you very much, Richard, and really happy to be here. And happy May Day to everyone, to all our comrades and socialists who have signed into this. Before I say anything, I just want to say this. A dear friend of mine died this week, Jude Woodward. She was a great socialist. She was a member of Ken Livingstone's team at the GLC. She was on the board of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign. She was a wonderful campaigner for women's rights in the Labour Party. And I want to just take this opportunity on May Day to honour her memory, because she was a great socialist and she'll be sadly missed. I want to talk about the fact that we here in the Labour movement tend to look at the economy in a very narrow way. We may not think it's narrow, but it is narrow because we're looking at mainly the domestic economy. And the domestic economy only functions in relation to the global economy. So if we want to tax Richard Branson, we have to understand that Richard Branson belongs to an international system which encourages him, enables him, and makes it possible for him not to pay taxes. And, you know, he'd be crazy if he did anything else, because the system is designed to benefit people like Richard Branson. And that is the system of global capitalism, basically of globalization. And I think the left has been a bit ambiguous about globalization, and we've got to start understanding that globalization is not in the interests of the worker, it's not in the interests of working people. It's very much in the interests of, it's been constructed to be in the interests of people like Branson and co. So I want us to take a much more internationalist perspective on the world. And I'm particularly concerned about this because I think that there's a real danger that many on the left of the movement, many left socialists, will become left nationalists. And it's not impossible. We already have some of them in the House of Lords, who are fiercely nationalist. And that's a dangerous position to be in, no matter where if you're progressive or not. It's very dangerous. The thing about what we have to be as socialists is internationalists. We have to understand that most of the problems we face, which includes the crisis, as Michael has said, of climate breakdown and Earth systems breakdown, and the climate doesn't recognize boundaries, doesn't recognize borders. If we're going to address the climate, we're going to have to do it internationally in cooperation with others. Now, you know, the great nationalists of our time are Donald Trump and Boris Johnson. But they're both fake nationalists. They're just fake nationalists. On the one hand, Donald Trump has got golf courses and hotels all over the world. There is no way that he wants to have a world which is just America first. What on earth would he do from making profits from abroad? And secondly, Boris Johnson wanted to take back control, but he made a speech on the 3rd of February at Greenwich, which showed that he was a hyper-globalization person. He's a hyper-globalist, right? So this thing about nationalism is faux nationalism. It's a contradiction that these guys are playing with, and they're doing it for a simple reason, and that is to gain political power. Now, I have to say that I'm not against the idea of seizing political power. I want us as socialists to understand that we really have to do that. We really have to seize political power. And that means we must start getting ruthless, if you like, in the way we think about things. But also, we've got to understand the international system. Now, the reason I feel most passionate about that is that I was born in South Africa. I grew up in South Africa, and I left there a long time ago. And I've got used to the English weather after 50 years. But even so, my heart is, of course, back with my family in South Africa. And these last few weeks, South Africa has endured the most appalling crisis. And I think most of us on the left are not really aware of what's going on. And so I want to explain. So what happened was, the minute the pandemic became serious, investors, creditors, and speculators gathered their monies up together and they fled out of countries like South Africa, stampeded out overnight. And they can do that because the system is designed to allow them to do that, right? And they rushed to the United States into the dollar. The effect of that was the dollar rose and their currencies fell, right? And what that means is they have to pay their debts in dollars. That means their debt rose, right? But they want to sell commodities, and simultaneously commodity prices fell. But they need commodity income to pay for these rising debts, right? So they have a crushed currency, they have rising debts, and then what happens is a rating agency moves into town and says, oh, we're going to downgrade you. So immediately South Africa is downgraded, which means immediately everybody else charges them even more for borrowing. They need to borrow to pay for pharmaceuticals and all the vital equipment they need to deal with a plague, with a pandemic, right? And now they're put into this extraordinarily painful condition where, you know, they're not a perfect economy. They haven't run their economy in the best way possible. That wasn't the problem. The problem is the power that the international system gives to investors, creditors, and speculators to just stampede out of the economy when they fancy it at their very own whim. Now, you know, we need to redesign the international system to say, your interests do not come first. The interests of the people of South Africa, of domestic, the people inside a domestic economy, they come first. The government is here to manage the economy in the interests of the people, and particularly in the interests of their own people, and that belong to their own democracy, rather than in the interest of an international financial elite. Now, we know that we can change that system. It may sound like, it may feel like that it's incredibly difficult. But back in 1933, and this is why the campaign that I'm part of called the Green New Deal is called the Green New Deal, when President Roosevelt came to power in 1933, on the 3rd of March, 1933, the very first thing he did on the night of his inauguration was to say, I'm going to end this international system called the gold standard. And the gold standard was globalization of that time, right? It was a system which prioritized Wall Street over the interests of the American people. Unemployment was very high in the United States, and they had a cataclysmic ecological crisis. They had the Dust Bowl. Whole swathes of the United States had been rendered barren because they had over-farmed it and so on. So they had this big ecological crisis, plus they had an economic crisis. And the country was effectively being run by Wall Street. And Roosevelt said, no. I'm taking Wall Street out of the driving seat of the economy, and I'm putting a democratically elected government back into the driving seat. And he said, and I'd like to do that tonight. I'm going to ask Wall Street to hand over their gold. And his advisor said, well, you can't do that. Tomorrow's Sunday. It's a holy day. You know, you can't do that. So he said, fine, we'll close the banks on Monday and I'll take the gold. And everybody thinks he closed the banks to save the banks, but he closed the banks on the Monday to get the gold into the treasury, and to say no longer, Wall Street, will you be deciding on the value of the currency and interest rates and so on. Now, I tell you this story to say that in very recent history, we have transformed the international financial system, and we've put the interests of creditors, speculators, and investors, we've subordinated those to the interests of the people. And the labor movement really starts to have to think again internationally, and about the fact that we are part of an international system. And if we want to do something about Richard Branson, we got to do something first of all about the international system. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks very much, Anne. And one of the very many important points I think Anne made in those remarks is the fact that we need to think about the system. I think there has been a tendency in our movement to think that the world is as unequal and poverty-ridden and unjust as it is because of a group of rather unpleasant individuals who make nasty choices because they're big bad blokes or big bad women or whatever they are, because in fact it's a system that encourages that behaviour. And as socialists we have to analyse that system and try and replace that system with something better. So I think that's something we all need to bear in mind. And of course, the emphasis on internationalism is very, very important indeed. I think in the context of the pandemic, many people may retreat into a kind of conservative nationalism without realizing that they're doing so. And on today of all days, International Workers' Day, it's important to remember our duty to be internationalists, because if we're not internationalists, we can't be socialists. So I'm delighted to introduce our next contributor, who is the former Chief Economic Advisor to the Shadow Chancellor, and he's just finishing drinking his tea. Rory McQueen. Welcome, Rory.
Thanks, Richard. Happy May Day to you and to everyone else on the call. I've been asked to talk for a few minutes about public services and post-pandemic in particular. So I won't go on too long about the past, but obviously we know now that the 10 years of spending cuts and austerity have left the NHS and public health very poorly prepared for a pandemic. And the NHS wasn't the worst hit department of government, but at a time when our population is ageing, we need to see health spending rising. It's clearly been inadequate, and it's clearly left us with not enough staff, not enough equipment, as we've seen over the last few weeks to months. But it's not just about the money, and that's one of the points I want to make here. We've also seen, for example, stories about outsourced staff who work in the NHS, but for private contractors who've had to carry on going to work even when the medical guidance was not to, because they don't get the sick leave entitlement which NHS staff do. And that puts them at risk, puts their families at risk, puts patients in the NHS at risk, and that puts all of us at risk. And that's a direct result of outsourcing, privatisation in the NHS. There was a story in the Guardian, today, about an NHS procurement manager setting up a side business, buying and selling PPE. I don't know if anyone else has seen that story. Sounds quite scandalous. Apparently, he wasn't making his profit from supplying to the NHS, although that's not what his website says. But he must be about the only company going that isn't. Maybe he should have registered in a tax haven, then he would have got some NHS contracts. But the NHS will always need these services and this equipment. And we should be asking, why are they being provided by any private company? And what is the system whereby NHS trusts are competing against each other for PPE, for tests, for testing facilities? These things have a real effect every day, the whole time. We're just seeing it particularly at the moment due to the pandemic and the focus on our health system. Some of it's obviously down to the Lansley reforms under the coalition government. But we also need to remember it started a long time before that. The last Labour government privatised the NHS supply chain, which is central to dealing with the pandemic at the moment. In 2018, the private owner of the NHS supply chain even tried to sue the Department of Health when they awarded the new contract to a rival multinational. And obviously, it's not just about the NHS. We know that £8 billion has been cut from social care budgets over the past decade. But we also know, again, replacing that money might be like pouring money into a leaking bucket. Dominic Raab gave the game away the other day. He says that the lack of information on COVID deaths in care homes is down to the decentralised nature of our care system. That decentralisation is a central part of the problem here. Only about 10% of care, I think, now is provided by the public sector. The rest across myriad, hundreds of thousands of providers. And as a result of that, the government has not felt responsible for care, hasn't felt responsible for information on the care system, data coming from care homes, and for the well-being of care home residents. They're not the employer. Even the local councillors aren't the employers. They don't feel accountable, and they haven't felt under pressure to give us the information about care homes that they have been doing about the NHS throughout this period. And don't forget, again, all those private care homes are going to be competing with each other for PPE at the moment. We know that they are. So it's only really when they come under stress that we see how resilient or otherwise the systems that we've built up in our public services are. We can really see more than anything else at the moment how underfunded but also how fragmented our public services are after 40 years, let's say, of neoliberal reforms. We have obviously also seen how resilient the staff in those sectors are. My father-in-law briefly is in a care home One of our family went to take him something the other day. He obviously couldn't go in. She handed something to one of the care workers and said, "How are you coping?" And the care worker just almost burst out in tears. She was welling up. She just couldn't speak in answer to that question of how are you coping. We're clapping for those key workers. We're clapping for the NHS. We're clapping for the social care workers every Thursday now. A lot of them don't like the term heroes. Makes them feel a bit uncomfortable. But all of those key workers, including private sector key workers, shop workers, postal workers. Remember, these posties are now in the private sector. Their private sector owners have now just decided they're not going to deliver letters on Saturdays anymore. Just like that. Government's not involved. We can't do anything about it because it was privatised by the coalition government. Some people have talked about COVID as an opportunity to advance socialist arguments. We would be utterly failing in our duty if all of us don't talk to others, point out the ways in which privatisation has undermined our public services over years. And remember, those public heroes can be turned into villains by the Tories and the media very quickly. One example we could see next year, NHS heroes being held up while the government says no pay rise for teachers because they've just been sitting on their arse for a few months. That kind of divide and rule tactics could be on the way. We can be making arguments for public services, for public provision and a public sector ethos. There's more on this in a document which John put out at a conference last year. You can Google Universal Basic Services. But we're now dependent on that public sector ethos, even despite decades of attacks and encouragement to think as individuals. We're still dependent on those people and that public sector ethos, and that should be encouragement for all of us in that. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Rory. That was really useful. One question I have, is that a political or a personal portrait in the background that I can see? Who is it? Do you want to tell us?
That's a good question. It's Virginia Woolf. Whether or not you want so personal or political, I think is probably the subject of been a few essays over the years on that one. I'll leave you to decide.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. And that brings me on to our final contributor. I'm delighted to welcome somebody that many of you will be familiar with, and that's John Hillary, former Director of War and Want and Labour's International Trade Advisor. So, John.
Richard, thank you so much. It's a really great pleasure to be able to speak after everyone else who's already been on. May Day solidarity greetings to everybody. And I'm hoping maybe just to round up with a few of the threads we've had already and trying to bring them together, particularly in the context of what Anne was saying about an internationalist approach to this problem, but also drawing out the threats to public services and the battle which we face now in trying to get a socialist agenda to be part of the discourse of how we come out of this crisis economically. And I think it's instructive when we're having this debate to think back to 2008, 2009, when we were coming out of the financial crisis then. And many of you will remember the language which was going around from Gordon Brown, from Obama, from Sarkozy. All of the world leaders were saying, we cannot go back. We cannot have business as usual. I mean, back in 2008, 2009, we didn't tend to use hashtags, but if we were using hashtags, we would have said, you know, whatever the current one is, no going back. Within a year, the G20, which had met in London and said, we will bail out the banks, we will restore the situation with masses, trillions of dollars of public money. Within a year, they had turned around together and through international coordinated action at the G20 in Toronto, they had imposed austerity as a 10-year project, which they saw was going to create the system for the restarting of capitalism exactly as it had been before, and making sure that the people paid for the crisis. And that then brought in this decade, not just of austerity, but also of neoliberal capitalist assault. So what they did first at the international level is they brought back the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, this unholy trinity of institutions, which were on their last legs at that time. But they used the crisis to restate them as the institutions of discipline in charge of the global economy. And why is that relevant? Because they set the rules, exactly as Anne was saying, they set the rules which determine who is going to benefit and who is going to pay for these crises in the future. We then saw this other wave of these mega trade deals going around the world, reshaping again in favor of capital the rules between us, between labor, and between the big transnational corporations which operate across the world. So we saw the big trade deals like TTIP and CETA, which called out a mass movement of people across Europe and across the world saying, we don't believe in that type of future. And again, what is the point of discussing trade rules when we have all of these very immediate problems which we're facing at the moment? Well, I'll give you two examples in respect of the coronavirus. The first is in relation to intellectual property rules. The intellectual property rules which come with copyright, with patents, with trademarks. And in the last few years, the UK and other countries at the WTO have signed up to a new provision which says that we are no longer allowed under the trade rules to have compulsory licensing of drugs. So we have to go cap in hand to the big private pharmaceutical companies under these new rules if we want to have access to the type of treatments, the type of vaccines which we will need to combat coronavirus. And there's a big international sign-on letter with people like Joe Stiglitz and the others, which is currently going around saying this is absolutely crazy. This is exactly what we were warning about. We need to break with these rules which put private profit ahead of public health and public well-being. The second area in which we have created this appalling situation for ourselves is in these new corporate courts, these investor state dispute settlement mechanisms, where transnational corporations are allowed to sue governments where they operate if the governments have brought in any new provisions, new laws, new regulations, which prevent those companies from making the same level of profits they were enjoying before. Now, under the coronavirus situation, we are seeing country after country quite correctly intervening to recreate the markets, to close down certain things, to prevent companies from operating. So what are they doing? They're going immediately to their lawyers to start seeing if they can use these provisions to sue our governments, to sue our people in order to get the profits back which they have lost. And this is, for me, just that sense of we have created this monster in the international system, which we now need to confront. And in the UK, we have a particular opportunity and a particular threat at the same time, because the UK, having come out of the European Union, is right now negotiating a new suite of trade deals with its trading partners across the world. And we learned, obviously, about the big one between the UK and the US, that absolutely, without any doubt, the NHS and other public services were on the table, in the frame, and very likely to be traded away. There needs to be a mass movement across the country to say that is absolutely unacceptable. We do not see the NHS or our other public services as commodities to be traded away in some sort of bargaining game with Donald Trump. Similarly, we need to be thinking about other elements of the trade deals. You know, why should we be trading food across the world? We've seen how vulnerable that makes everybody in the face of these type of crises. Surely we should be looking to localize economies. And I absolutely echo what everybody else has been saying about this being a defining moment in terms of climate change and our action to combat climate crisis. If we create a world where it's possible to trade things absolutely with no recognition of the impact of doing that on the climate, then we're storing up more and more problems for ourselves in the future. We now have an opportunity to rethink that and to say, yes, there are certain things which we absolutely need to trade across the world, but there are others which we don't. And so we need to be, you know, planning with an eye to the climate action within all of that agenda. But I also echo actually what Apsana said earlier. If we're talking about bailouts this time, and particularly bailouts for the big companies, we need to think what we got wrong last time. Last time, Gordon Brown did the unimaginable. He found enough public money to buy the banks. But the problem is, having bought the banks, he then gave them straight back to the private sector again. So we had nationalisation without nationalisation. Now, without the conditions which we should have put on those financial institutions, which we had bought, which would then make them operate in the public interest. This time, if we are going to be pumping out similar eye-watering sums from taxpayers' money to bail out these companies, we must impose conditions, conditionality on those companies, so that they have to do the right thing, both socially and also environmentally. And the concept of conditionality, the concept of having to impose conditions, brings me to my final point, because we know of conditionality as a concept in the context of the conditions which were put by the World Bank and the IMF on the countries of the global south when they went to get debt relief in the 1980s. We have, as a result of that, have imposed these appalling debt crises on those countries of the global south. And if we today, on the day of international solidarity, May Day, if we are looking towards a global future where economy is made fairer and more just, we have to see the impact of coronavirus and the impact of the other crises on the people of the global south. When we in Britain are talking about whether we have enough ventilators, you just need to think there are countries in sub-Saharan Africa, all across sub-Saharan Africa, who do not have one ventilator for the whole country. And there is no prospect of them getting any of those equipment which they need. This is a crisis which hits us hard, but will hit them infinitely harder. Anne's already mentioned the economic and financial impacts. If you think of the supply chain impacts on all of those people who rely upon the exports for their jobs, let's say the garment workers, the women garment workers in Bangladesh, there is no safety net. There is no social welfare system which they can fall back on. So one of the key calls which is coming out at the moment is for a massive program of debt cancellation with absolutely no conditions attached. A debt cancellation which says we, as the rich world, recognize that the impact of this crisis on the poorest in our global community is going to be extreme. This is our moment to step up to the plate and say, we will cancel the debts unilaterally, unconditionally, once and for all of those poorest people. And I think that, as a message of solidarity this May Day, is the sort of campaign which we should all get behind. Thank you. Thanks very much, John. That's wonderful. We've got about 10, 15 minutes for questions. Before I turn to the questions that I've just been reviewing, it's fantastic to see that we've had 1,100 registrations for this event in just 24 hours. I think that really shows the level of interest in these economic debates and these discussions that we're having. So we can take some real encouragement from that. And I think as well, when we consider the whole international question, and John's quite rightly raised how hard many countries in the global south are being affected by this in Africa and elsewhere. We've also got to see the damaging effects of sanctions on Iran and Venezuela, for example, damaging enough on ordinary people in any event, but even more damaging when countries are trying to combat coronavirus. And it's awful to consider that the President of the United States has seen coronavirus in Venezuela, for example, as an opportunity to tighten the screw further, as an opportunity to achieve their political objectives. So this is the kind of thing, as internationalists, we need to be speaking out against. So in terms of the questions, thanks to everybody who's been submitting questions. We've only got time for a few, but here we go. The first one is for John McDonnell, and the question is, on International Workers' Day, what can we do to try and secure greater worker ownership, John?
Okay, one of the key things, it leads on from what John Hilary has just said about the sort of issues we should coalesce around in this coming period. We've now got to think as a movement overall, labour and trade union movement, a progressive movement, about how we can discuss and, well, I suppose, discuss and construct a program, a policy program, which sets out a vision for the society that we want. And that's what this discussion was all about, bringing people together from different specialisms to address the problems within their particular area of policy, but also to then look at solutions that we can put together as a program. So a number of us now are trying to see how we can work together, develop a program overall, which can provide the basis of reform policies, well, basically to change society. And, you know, let's be ambitious, change the world, because exactly as Anne and John Hillary have said, you can't do this. Socialism isn't going to work in one country. It's got to be a global initiative overall. And that's what a number of us now are trying to say, how can we come together to work on that? And we'll be bringing together various experts, just as those today and others, to throw their ideas in. But more importantly, we want to reach out across the movement to all those individual campaigns and all those other individuals to draw upon their creativity as well, so that not only are we developing a program of ideas, but then mobilizing those into campaigns around those ideas. And one of the issues there is around public ownership. There's the issues that Prem has raised about worker accountability on boards, worker representation on boards, of course, but also Prem and others were developing their ideas about worker ownership as well, stakeholder ownership and control of companies. That's the first thing. The second thing was about making sure that not only, as Rory has said, we defend public ownership, but also we reverse the privatizations that have taken place and have been so extraordinary, really exposed in this crisis for how they've undermined our public services and undermined the people and the standards of living of those people who work in them. But also it is then looking at how we extend public ownership in different forms in different ways. And one of those ways, of course, you saw in the last two of their manifestos was we said at least doubling the size of the cooperative sector, for example. But also it is about those areas of and sectors of the economy that we think should be in public ownership and democratic control. And we put out ideas about the nature of that public ownership so that it is actually based upon true democratic control rather than some form of centralized system, managerial system. So that's the debate we have to have. One campaign that is bringing a lot of these issues together is a group called We Own It. And Kat Hobbs is their spokesperson. She's part of the group I'm working with now to develop this program. If you go onto their website, you'll see that they're first of all, developing ideas around public ownership, of course, but more importantly, they're putting them into practice in terms of campaigning. So if you want to get involved in that, go on the We Own It website and throw your weight behind their campaigning. At the moment, they've got a petition with regard to their health service, but they do a whole range of campaigning, both in terms of petitioning, lobbying, and direct action campaign right the way across public services or services that should be public. And they've done great campaigns on railways, water, and energy. So We Own It. Go to their website and throw your weight behind their campaigning.
Thanks very much, John. And the next question I've got is for Anne Pettifor, and it's, why are the banks not passing lowered interest rates to customers? I think you have to unmute yourself, Anne, if that's okay.
Thanks. They're not doing that because we haven't placed conditions on them. I think this is exactly what Hillary was saying, John Hillary was saying, which is that, you know, the terms and conditions that we should impose, and our central bank doesn't see its role as ensuring that the banks are only licensed if they do that. And that's why actually access to finance for so many of our SMEs has been impossible over the last 10 years, never mind now. Even now it's particularly difficult, but even over this last 10 years, it's been so difficult for them because in fact, banks were borrowing cheap from the Bank of England and lending dear. And you know, that was the easiest way to make a load of money. So we've got to do something about the way the banks do behave and the way they And I think what I'd like to say here is that we sometimes, we think about these big institutions as being beyond us and so on. But the Bank of England only has the power to bail out the banks because behind the Bank of England are 30 million taxpayers, including you and me. And whether we like it or not, you know, we are tied into PAYE, or we pay our, if we're, if we're on part-time employment, we pay once a year. You know, Richard Branson may not pay his taxes, but we pay our taxes. And that gives the Bank of England terrific authority. Without those 30 million taxpayers, the Bank of England wouldn't have what is in fact the collateral that it has to create liquidity to bail out the private banking system. What that tells us is that we are absolutely central to this process and we should have leverage over it. If you look at the Federal Reserve of the United States, they've got, I think it's 60 million taxpayers backing the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve is even more powerful than we are. And the same applies to ECB, which I think has about 60 million taxpayers. If you go to Malawi, their central bank has virtually no power because they don't have a sound tax collection system and they don't have many taxpayers. So all I'm trying to say is that I think we need a new campaign, and I want to call it Taxpayers Unite. And I want to diss the Taxpayers Alliance, which never really acts in the interest of taxpayers. It acts in the interest of the 1%. We ought to understand that the power the Bank of England has is because of us. And that ought to help us to understand we have leverage over the system, if only we got ourselves together in order to exercise that leverage.
Thanks very much, Anne. And I've got a question now for the whole panel. So anybody who wants to answer, please indicate and jump in. And the question is, how do we ensure that COVID-19 and the crisis, the public health crisis, does not become an excuse for many more years of Tory austerity? Who wants to have a go at that? Anne, do you want to come in?
I've just spoken. Well, let me say this. Anyone who's talking about austerity now is out of their minds, basically. What we're facing now is a prolonged, deep debt deflationary depression. And I don't think that people have got half a clue as to how serious this is going to be. And if in the event of a collapse, if you like, of capitalism is being suspended. It doesn't operate, it's not there. There's nothing. There's only the government, there's only the state, right? So we have, you know, the collapse of oil industry, we have the collapse of the car industries, there's talk of cars in ships lining up outside the harbors in the United States because they can't deliver the cars because nobody's buying cars. There's nowhere to park the oil because nobody's buying oil. The system has really, now this is going to lead to a collapse in prices, a collapse in businesses are going to go bust. Of course, all the big businesses are going to come and take over. But in the meantime, you know, people are going to lose their jobs. There's going to be high level unemployment that will make even lower prices. It'll be a deflationary spiral. And in those circumstances, the very last thing you want to do is impose austerity. And anyone who thinks like that, and I tell you, not even the Tories are thinking like that, not even the Treasury. The Treasury is having to change its tune. The OBR is having to change its tune. Very soon, who knows, but the IFS may even change its tune, right? Even this IFS has had to be silenced because it's such a balanced budget fanatic, really. So, you know, we're in a different ball game completely. And you know, the sort of George Osborne's talking about we need to retrench in the future. Well, I'm sorry, but you know, there's no chance for that. Our big challenge is going to be how do we revive capitalism? That's what the Tories are going to have to think about. How do they bring it back? You know, and our opportunity is we have to take the time of this space and say, how do we build a new economy? How do we build the economy that we make? This crisis has taught us that the billionaires, as Prem said, the billionaires don't make the economy. They're lost without us. We make the economy. Now we've got to be thinking about what kind of economy we want to create. And we've got to be pushing it out there. And we have to win political power. I say that again.
And that's great, Anne. Thanks very much. Prem, do you want to come in on this question about austerity? If you unmute yourself there.
Is that okay? Can you hear me
Yes,
now?
great.
Yeah, if I just quote what Boris Johnson said yesterday, he was asked about austerity. He said, "I never liked the term austerity. It won't be part of his approach." Well, actually, he didn't rule it out. That's more important observation, and they can call it anything else they like. But I think the Tory DNA is that for the last decade, they've really been intoxicated with austerity. It's hard to see how they are going to give public sector workers 10-15% increase to make up for the wage freezes. Clapping is one thing, but giving them a reasonably good wage is something else. I think at the end, what I would say is, what we are talking about is not some invisible hand of fate. What we are talking about is the very visible hand of social institutions. These are the institutions which we can all change. We can change through trade unions, through Labour Party, through our own engagement, education programs. We need to inform people, as Anne and Andrew said, that the system does not really work for most people. And that is what we really got to do. But austerity is definitely a no, no, no. And even wiser capitalists would know that if you erode people's purchasing power, there is no way you can rebuild an economy, because people need to have enough in their pocket. And that is where Keynes came in, and that's where Roosevelt came in as well. So we actually may well need to rethink and revisit some of the things which Roosevelt did and try to do them.
Richard, I'm going to have to go, I'm afraid, because I have another meeting. So please excuse.
Great to see you. Thanks so much, Anne, for your contribution. Really appreciate it. Take care then.
Thanks.
We've just got time for one very last question, which is directed at Andrew. And it is about universal basic income. The question is, there are hundreds of thousands of people falling through the gaps in terms of the bailout and the protections. Given this, does this mean that it's now time to advocate for universal basic income?
I think it's one of a number of options. I mean, I think at the time, a temporary UBI at the very beginning of this would have been a perfectly legitimate thing for government to do. Longer term, I don't think it's the solution. I know opinions vary even on this panel on that, but I think a minimum income guarantee where benefits are raised significantly, as I said in my contribution, is a better way forward, and with wage support as well within the economy, higher wages, higher minimum wage within for people in work. So I'm not convinced of the case for a UBI, because often it's been associated with the right, and I think in the hands of a Conservative government, it would be used to deplete public services and create a market system, which is of course what Milton Friedman said when he backed a universal basic income. So I'm not ideologically opposed to it. I think in certain contexts it can work, and I think at the beginning of this crisis it might have stopped people falling through the gaps in the way we've seen. But longer term, it's not my preferred solution to social security.
Thanks very much, Andrew. I'm afraid we've got to draw it to a close there, but I'd like to thank everyone who's tuned in. I'd like to thank the whole panel, and thanks to John McDonnell for drawing all these experts together. I'd like to thank Apsana and Anne Pettifor and Michael, who've had to leave the call, and like to thank everyone who's still on. So I hope that everyone has a fantastic May Day, a fantastic International Workers' Day. I hope people can tune in to the third and final session of the day, which has been hosted by the People's Assembly Against Austerity. And all the best, and let's hope that once this crisis is over, we can help to shape a better, a more equal, a more decent society and economy. All the best. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Richard.
Take care.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.